My name is Jen, and today I'm going to be reviewing a study conducted by Reedy and colleagues exploring teen dating violence and injury among youth exposed to violence. To date, the research examining gender differences in dating violence has resulted in conflicting findings. On the one hand, males are predominantly the perpetrators of dating violence, and on the other hand, there is no difference between genders. It is apparent to me that the rationale for the current study is to reconcile these conflicting findings. The objective of this present study was to assess gender differences among adolescents reporting teen dating violence, or TDV, as well as assess the frequency of TDV at multiple age points in a high-risk sample of youth previously exposed to violence. The sample was made up of 1,141 students aged between 11 to 17 years old, selected from 35 different schools across Texas. The sample consisted of 706 females and 435 males. Students were referred for screening by social workers or school counsellors if they suspected that the students were at risk of TDV. Semi-structured interviews were conducted first during intake to assess whether the students had been subject to child abuse or had been the witness, victim, or perpetrator of some form of violence. Students who reported one or more type of violence exposure were eligible to participate in the study and would go on to complete a survey. Eligible students reported on 6 indices of TDV perpetration and victimisation. Questions were adapted from 2 measures and items were developed where necessary. The measures used in the study are Conflict in Adolescent Dating Relationships Inventory, also known as the CADRI, and the Safe Dates TDV scales. Several data analysis methods were used in this study, which included multiple linear regression, pairwise deletion, moderation, and simple slope analyses, to name a few. The results of the study revealed that females perpetrated psychological and physical TDV more. However, males perpetrated sexual TDV more. When comparing the frequency of TDV across adolescents, males reported more sexual TDV and victimisation at younger ages, whereas females reported more sexual victimisation at older ages. More females also reported fear and victimisation associated with intimidation compared to males, and by age 17, females also reported more injury perpetration than males. The findings suggest that of the adolescents exposed to violence, the proportion of males and females that report victimisation may be comparable. This is contrary to other research suggesting that females experience more sexual TDV. Interestingly, males reported more sexual TDV victimisation at younger ages. However, as the age increased, so did the trend towards females reporting more victimisation. Although the results of the study indicate that during early adolescence, males are equally at risk of sexual TDV, it appears that the fear is far greater in females. Whilst I can discern the overall purpose of this study to a degree, I note that the hypotheses have not been explicitly stated in the introduction. This shows a lack of prediction and leads me to wonder whether the authors have really thought about what results their study may yield. It is also apparent to me that the constructs weren't identified or defined properly within the introduction. The authors mentioned this term high-risk sample within the study. However, they only offer a brief description of high risk as youth exposed to violence in the home or community. I believe this term could be defined and operationalised a lot more clearly. By violence, do they mean physical violence, or are they talking about a more holistic definition of violence, which includes emotional violence, psychological abuse, etc.? It is quite important for this term to be defined more clearly, particularly as these are the sample characteristics in the study. We know that the students were from 35 schools across Texas. However, we don't know much about the characteristics of these schools. Were they public schools, private, a mixture? We also don't know much about the socioeconomic status of the sample. For instance, were these 35 schools in disadvantaged areas, or were they more elite schools? Or perhaps was the sample a more representative mixture? Also, the sample is restrictive to school children only and not entirely representative of teenagers on the whole. So what about those adolescents who aren't in school? Results could differ significantly across adolescents in school versus those who are not in school. Particularly as those who are not in school aren't receiving mentoring from teachers, and they may not be presented with the same opportunities to learn socially acceptable behaviour among their peers. I personally think that all of this impacts on generalisability. Also, perceptions of the school counsellors and social workers were relied on for referrals. While this can be subjective, it is also important to acknowledge that after these referrals were made, the students were then formally screened using semi-structured interviews. So ultimately, their selection criteria was based on participant scores on the interview. However, it is still possible that school counsellors or workers may have missed some students who had truly experienced violence. These students perhaps flew under the radar. And it could be plausible that students with less overt signs of violence exposure were systematically excluded. For example, the counsellors and social workers didn't pick up on this and therefore didn't refer them. This would further imply that their results can be only generalised to the more outwardly obvious type cases, which highlights to me how systematic recruitment issues can impact on the generalisability of findings. It is worth noting, however, in regard to the methodology, that the authors managed some of the complex ethical issues very well. They have done an excellent job in approaching what is a challenging topic sensitively and appropriately, and this is evidenced in their large sample size of a high-risk youth. The survey is made up entirely of self-report scales, and although such measures can be subjective, this method of data collection remains appropriate, particularly as the scales are comprehensive in gauging the different types of violence and abuse. However, it should still be noted that there can be issues with underreporting in self-report scales, and some participants may not have fully disclosed the amount or extent of violence that they have experienced. Also, in regards to the scales, the authors have stated that items were developed where necessary. However, what were these items developed based on? I found this to be particularly vague, and I really needed more information around this. Now, most of the data analysis methods used in this study are quite robust. However, it is reasonable to argue that pairwise deletion is a poor method for managing missing data. So researchers have argued that using this method may ultimately lead to challenges when it comes to drawing inferences to the entire sample, and perhaps a more advanced method such as multiple imputation could have been used instead. Another critique on the results of the study is around the interaction terms for three indices nearing significance. This to me feels as though the authors are clutching at straws. It is as though they've ran numerous tests, sifted through results, and reported something that came close to significance. Rather, they could have been more selective with their data analysis, carefully aligning some key analysis techniques with some targeted hypotheses. This issue really starts right back at the beginning of the study, where the authors didn't state specific hypotheses, but rather they just wanted to explore patterns. This is not statistically justifiable. The finding is either significant or it's not. And if it's not significant, then the authors probably should not have reported it. The study is reflective of school-aged children. However, the article does mention that this reverses in adulthood. So it may be worthwhile for the authors to review the same cohort at adulthood to further explore and determine if they could support their claim. I do agree that the findings of this study may inform counsellors, raise awareness, educate and assist in identifying appropriate treatment strategies. I argue this as I myself had never heard of the coined term TDV or teen dating violence, specifically until reading this article. When I think about violence within relationships, I think about domestic violence or family violence. And those terms tend to guide me more towards young adults and adults as opposed to young adolescents. Therefore, I agree that this research has the potential to raise awareness and educate the public on the younger cohort who may be experiencing violence within their relationships. Overall, I found the author's thoughts around practical implications to be very well developed. For example, the authors suggest that the direct assessment of sexual abuse at young ages should not be restricted to abuse by adult, and particularly as sexual abuse by a dating partner may start as early as 11 years of age. This therefore highlights also that screening and intervention should commence early. Thank you.